My stepfather stole my family's company tens of millions, so I made sure he lost everything. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was sitting in my father's old office, which technically belonged to me now, staring at a quarterly financial report that refused to make sense no matter how many times I checked the numbers. There was a discrepancy, $29,500 missing from an account that should have been airtight, a small enough amount that it could be dismissed as an accounting oversight, but large enough to set off every alarm in my head, because my father had drilled financial discipline into me from the time I was a teenager. He had always told me that numbers don't just disappear, they move. And if you can't see where they're going, someone is hiding them from you. For 35 years, my father had built this company from the ground up, putting everything he had into making it successful. I had been working alongside him since I was 18, absorbing everything he taught me about operations, logistics, and the value of keeping an honest, well-run business. 6 years ago, he suffered a heart attack right at his desk, a death that felt almost fitting for a man who never once considered retirement, but one that shattered my mother, my sister, and me in ways we were still recovering from. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life at his side, struggled with the loss more than any of us. Though my sister and I were initially wary when she started dating again after just a year, we didn't say anything because we knew our father wouldn't have wanted her to be alone. Then Richard came into our lives, appearing at one of our company's charity galas like he had always belonged there, shaking hands and making people laugh with the kind of effortless charm that put everyone at ease. Within 6 months, he had married my mother, and within a year, he had somehow convinced the board that the company needed his fresh leadership to take it to the next level. I had been too busy running daily operations to put up much of a fight, trusting that as long as I maintained the standards my father had set, things would continue as they always had. At first, it seemed like Richard knew what he was doing. The stock price went up. Investors were happy, and nobody seemed to question his decisions because, on the surface, the company was thriving. But then the small changes started creeping in. Longtime employees with decades of experience suddenly resigned, supplier contracts being rewritten to include vendors I had never heard of, and policy shifts that made no logical sense for the company's long-term stability. My sister Charlotte, who worked in the legal department, was the first to voice concerns, telling me over coffee one morning that some of the new contracts were deliberately written in convoluted legal jargon, which made it nearly impossible to trace where the money was going. That conversation was what made me start looking deeper, keeping my investigation quiet because I knew better than to confront Richard without hard evidence. The more I dug, the more it became impossible to ignore the pattern emerging in the numbers. Money was moving in ways that defied explanation, with resources being allocated to projects that didn't seem to exist, shell companies appearing on payment logs with no discernible products or services, and a growing gap between reported profits and actual cash flow. Ethan, my best friend since college and the company's financial officer, had always been meticulous with the books. When I showed him what I had found, he confirmed that these transactions had been deliberately disguised to look like routine expenses. The final confirmation that something was deeply wrong came when Richard barged into my office unannounced while Ethan and I were going over transaction records, his expression dark with barely controlled anger as he demanded to know what I was doing with those files. I had been in enough board meetings with him to recognize the particular shade of red. His face turned when he felt his control slipping. I kept my voice level as I told him I was simply reviewing the third quarter reports, since there were some inconsistencies. I needed to understand. His response was immediate and filled with venom, dismissing my concerns as paranoia while launching into yet another condescending lecture about how my father's outdated methods were holding the company back. Before I could get another word in, he cut me off with a final blow, loudly announcing that he would be recommending my termination at the next board meeting, effectively ending my career at the company my father had built from nothing. I knew better than to let my anger show, and instead I let him storm out, slamming the door behind him in some childish attempt at dominance, while Ethan let out a low whistle from his spot across the desk, shaking his head at the sheer arrogance of the man. I didn't have the luxury of reacting emotionally, not when the stakes were this high, so instead of dwelling on my imminent termination, I turned my laptop screen toward Ethan and told him that I had finally figured out where that missing money had gone. That night, my mother called me in tears, pleading with me to apologize to Richard and put this whole thing behind us since he had convinced her that I was the one causing unnecessary problems by questioning his leadership. I wanted to tell her the truth right then, to lay out every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated contract, every shred of evidence that proved Richard was systematically bleeding the company dry, but I could hear his voice in the background, feeding her more lies, and I knew that it wasn't the right time to tell her what I had uncovered. Instead, I swallowed my frustration, reassured her that everything would work out, and ended the call, knowing that I couldn't afford to wait any longer. The moment I hung up, I sent a message to Charlotte, reminding her of the contingency plan we had discussed months ago, knowing that the time had come to put it into motion before Richard could do any more damage. Her response came almost immediately, confirming that she was already ahead of me since Aubrey from HR had sent over old company files that contained something I wasn't going to believe. As I leaned back in my father's chair, staring at the framed photo of him standing in front of the factory, on opening day, I couldn't help but hear his voice in my head, repeating the lesson he had taught me as a teenager about how business wasn't just about trusting people. It was about always having the paperwork to prove that trust was earned. I promised him then and there that I had the paperwork, and Richard had absolutely no idea what was about to hit him. The moment I sent that message to Charlotte, I knew there was no turning back, because once we put this plan in motion, Richard would realize just how much we had uncovered, and he would do everything in his power to protect himself, even if it meant burning the company to the ground, before he could be held accountable. Ethan stayed late with me that night, helping me piece together the final threads of the financial puzzle, and by the time we were finished, there was no doubt left in our minds that Richard had been orchestrating this for years, slowly embedding himself into every aspect of the business, while ensuring that when the time came, he could extract as much wealth as possible without leaving a trace. By the time I left the office, my phone was already buzzing with messages from board members, most of whom had probably just received Richard's version of events, painting me as some paranoid, disgruntled son who couldn't handle change and was lashing out in desperation. I ignored every single one of them, knowing that they would all be singing a very different tune. Once they saw the documents we had compiled, the sheer volume of fraudulent activity making it impossible for even the most blindly loyal board member to dismiss. As I pulled into my driveway, Charlotte sent another message, letting me know that she had quietly transferred copies of every critical document to a secure server, ensuring that even if Richard tried to erase his tracks, we would still have everything we needed to bury him. The next morning, I walked into the office expecting tension, but even I wasn't prepared for the way people looked at me like I was already a ghost, like they had been warned not to get too close because I wouldn't be around much longer. Ethan told me that Richard had been meeting with department heads all morning, making it clear that my time at the company was coming to an end and anyone caught supporting me would be seen as a liability, their careers just as disposable as mine. It didn't surprise me in the slightest because men like Richard didn't just remove threats, they poisoned the entire environment, ensuring that once their enemies were gone, there was no one left who might remember them as anything other than a failure. Before I even made it to my office, my assistant whispered that I had been locked out of several internal systems, an obvious attempt by Richard to prevent me from accessing more information. But what he didn't know was that Charlotte had anticipated this and already backed up every relevant file before he even considered cutting me off. As I stepped inside my office, Ethan was already waiting, pulling up the latest batch of flagged transactions, and within seconds, I could see exactly what Richard was doing in real time, shifting funds into accounts under newly formed subsidiaries, likely planning to siphon as much as possible before the inevitable collapse. Before we could analyze it further, my phone rang, my mother's name flashing across the screen, and I already knew, before answering, that she was calling to convince me once again to apologize to Richard and make this all go away. As soon as I answered, I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, like she had spent the entire night arguing with him, trying to find some way to mend the growing rift between us, completely unaware that I had no intention of patching things up with the man actively dismantling everything my father had built. She told me that Richard was willing to let things go if I simply stepped down quietly, walked away without making a scene, and gave him the respect he deserved as the company's rightful leader. I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the frustration boiling in my chest because, no matter how much I wanted to believe that my mother was starting to see through his lies, it was painfully obvious that she was still convinced that this was nothing more than a personal dispute rather than a calculated attempt to destroy our family's legacy. I told her that I understood why she wanted to believe the best in him, but the truth was much uglier than she realized, and when the time was right, I would show her exactly why I could never, under any circumstances, let this go. She hesitated, clearly torn between the man she married and the son who had never given her a reason to doubt him. But before she could respond, I told her that I had to go and hung up before she could try convincing me again. Charlotte sent another message, telling me that she had found something buried deep in the old files that our father had kept locked away, something that changed everything we thought we knew about Richard's involvement in our company. It turned out that our father had documented multiple takeover attempts by unidentified shell companies over the years, all of them failing before they could gain any real foothold. But the truly damning part was that every single one of them could be traced back to Richard long before he ever met our mother. He had been circling our family business like a predator for over a decade, waiting for the perfect opportunity to sink his teeth in, and the moment he saw his chance, he didn't hesitate to use our mother as his way in. That revelation hit harder than anything else, because it confirmed that none of this was coincidence, that every moment of Richard's presence in our lives had been carefully calculated, that his marriage to our mother had never been about love but about securing access to the company he had been unable to acquire through corporate means. I sat in Charlotte's apartment that night, takeout containers scattered across the table, while Ethan scrolled through financial records from Richard's past ventures, each one showing the same pattern. He would marry into a family business, take control, drain every asset he could, and then walk away just before it all collapsed. Charlotte pulled up articles from small newspapers detailing the aftermath of his previous endeavors. Factories shut down, employees left jobless, families who had lost everything because they had trusted the wrong man. It wasn't just about money anymore, not that it ever had been, because Richard wasn't simply trying to enrich himself. He was a parasite, moving from company to company, destroying everything in his path without a second thought for the people left in the wreckage. I knew in that moment that exposing him wasn't just about protecting our company. It was about making sure he never had the opportunity to do this to anyone else ever again. Charlotte sent one last message before I left, telling me that if we were going to take him down, we needed to move fast, because if Richard got even the slightest inkling that we were ahead of him, he would disappear before we had the chance to finish what we started. The next morning, I met my mother at her favorite diner, the same place our father used to take us every Sunday, the familiarity of it making it that much harder to tell her what she needed to hear. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, already looking exhausted before I even spoke. And when she begged me once again to let this go, I slid my phone across the table, pulling up an old photo of Richard standing at another woman's wedding 15 years ago, smiling for the camera like he hadn't just torn another family apart. My mother stared at the screen in disbelief, her hands shaking as she whispered that it had to be a mistake. But when I told her there was more, that I had the records, the financial statements, the proof that he had done this over and over again, she looked up at me with something I hadn't seen in years: fear. I handed her a USB drive, telling her that when she was ready, everything she needed to know was on there. But she had to be careful because the moment Richard realized she was doubting him, he would turn on her just as quickly as he had turned on everyone else. She didn't say anything as she took the drive, gripping it tightly in her hands like she already knew that once she opened it, there would be no going back. As I walked out of the diner, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan, telling me that Richard had started pulling people into closed-door meetings, scrambling to cover his tracks. But it was already too late. The walls were closing in, and he didn't even know it yet. By the time I walked into the office the next morning, I could feel the shift in the air, a quiet tension wrapping itself around every conversation, every passing glance, every hushed whisper in the hallways, as if everyone could sense that something was about to break but couldn't quite put their finger on what. Richard had been busy pulling department heads into closed-door meetings, making it clear that there were consequences for loyalty to the wrong people, ensuring that no one felt safe enough to ask questions about why he was so desperate to keep me out of the picture. Charlotte had already sent me an update before I even arrived, letting me know that several longtime employees had suddenly resigned overnight, their positions quietly replaced by names none of us recognized, further proof that Richard was clearing out anyone who might stand in his way. Ethan met me in my office, barely waiting for the door to close behind us before launching into the latest round of financial inconsistencies, each one more blatant than the last. As if Richard had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary now that he believed he had eliminated his only real threat. His arrogance worked in our favor because the sloppier he became, the easier it was to trace where the money was going every misstep. Another piece of evidence we could use to bury him once and for all. Charlotte had already secured copies of the most critical documents, transferring them to encrypted servers, ensuring that even if Richard somehow figured out what we were doing, he wouldn't be able to erase the proof before it was too late. The moment that solidified just how reckless he had become came when Ethan showed me an invoice flagged just hours before, listing a six-figure payment to a non-existent consulting firm, registered under a shell company, linked directly to Richard's personal attorney. I stared at the document, knowing that it wasn't just another attempt at siphoning company money, but a clear indication that he was preparing for the final stage of his exit plan, liquidating everything he could before disappearing without a trace. That realization sent a cold wave of urgency through me because if he was moving this aggressively, it meant that he knew his time was running out, and if we didn't stop him now, we might never get another chance. Charlotte called me as I was heading into the boardroom, her voice low but steady, as she told me that our mother had finally opened the USB drive, had finally seen for herself the evidence we had been trying to show her for weeks, had finally understood that the man she had married was nothing more than a professional con artist who had spent years destroying families just like ours. There was a hesitation in her voice, a lingering uncertainty about how our mother would handle knowing that her entire marriage had been a carefully constructed lie. But we didn't have time to dwell on that now, not when Richard was already trying to tighten his grip before everything slipped through his fingers. The board meeting started exactly on time, but Richard walked in 5 minutes late, carrying himself with the kind of forced confidence that only came from a man who had convinced himself that he was still in control despite every warning sign screaming otherwise. He didn't look at me as he took his seat at the head of the table, didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't give any indication that he knew I had spent the last several weeks unraveling every secret he had tried to keep hidden. Instead, he launched straight into his usual performance, listing off manipulated financial reports, painting an illusion of success, pretending that everything was operating exactly as it should be, completely oblivious to the fact that the people in this room were no longer as easily swayed as they had been before. Charlotte had prepared the files ahead of time, each board member receiving a thick folder of documented fraud, bank transfers, and company records proving that Richard had spent years orchestrating the systematic dismantling of our business. I watched the exact moment he realized what was happening, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the way his breathing changed just enough to betray the panic setting in beneath the surface. He tried to laugh it off, tried to dismiss the evidence as nothing more than an elaborate attempt to smear his reputation. But no one was buying it, not when every document was sourced directly from the company's own financial records, not when every number aligned too perfectly to be anything but the truth. Before he could regain his footing, the chairwoman of the board cut him off, her voice sharp and unwavering as she pointed out that these findings weren't just concerning but legally damning, that if even a fraction of these accusations held up under scrutiny, the consequences would be catastrophic for both him and anyone who had knowingly aided him. Richard's confidence cracked then just slightly, just enough for me to see the fear creeping in around the edges, but before he could try to manipulate his way out of it, the conference room doors opened and my mother stepped inside. She looked different, not like the woman who had spent the past few weeks defending him, not like the woman who had begged me to let this go, not like the woman who had spent years believing in the lie he had carefully constructed around her. She carried my father's old leather briefcase, the same one he had used every day for as long as I could remember, and as she walked to the head of the table, she didn't even glance at Richard, didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't give him the opportunity to try to twist this moment in his favor. She set the briefcase down in front of the board, her voice calm but resolute as she explained that inside were my father's personal records files. He had kept hidden, proof that he had been building a case against Richard long before his death. For the first time since this all started, Richard didn't have anything to say, didn't have a rehearsed excuse, didn't have a calculated response, because this was evidence he hadn't accounted for, evidence that came directly from a man he could no longer silence, evidence that stripped away any last shred of plausible deniability he had left. I didn't look away as he slowly pushed back from the table, as he reached for his phone, as he started making his way toward the door like he could somehow escape this. But Ethan was already there, standing in his path, voice steady as he told him to sit down because we weren't finished yet. I could see the calculations running through Richard's head, weighing his options, searching for an exit, realizing that there was none because this wasn't just a case of fraud anymore. It was something much bigger, something that couldn't be swept under the rug, something that would follow him long after he was escorted out of this building. He didn't sit, didn't respond, didn't make any attempt to argue his innocence, because I think in that moment he finally understood what I had known all along. He had already lost, and no amount of manipulation could change that now. The vote to remove him was unanimous, every single board member in agreement that his leadership had not only been unethical, but catastrophic for the future of the company. That his presence was no longer just a liability, but a direct threat to everything we had worked to rebuild. As security moved to escort him out, he turned to look at me for the first time that day, his expression blank, his posture rigid, his voice eerily calm as he told me that this wasn't over, that I had no idea what I had started, that I would regret this. I didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the threat, didn't let him think for even a second that his words held any weight, because at the end of the day, it didn't matter what he believed, didn't matter what desperate plans he was trying to form in his mind, didn't matter how much he convinced himself that he could still find a way out. He was done, and as I watched the doors close behind him, I knew that for the first time in years, the company was finally back in the right hands, exactly where it should have been all along. Richard didn't go quietly, because men like him never did always believing until the very last moment that they could manipulate, intimidate, or outmaneuver their way out of whatever consequences were catching up to them. After security removed him from the boardroom, he immediately went into damage control mode, trying to frame the entire situation as a personal vendetta, telling investors, employees, and anyone who would listen that this was nothing more than a desperate attempt by a bitter son to reclaim power he had never been capable of handling. His arrogance would have been almost amusing if not for the fact that he was still dangerous, still someone who had access to too many accounts, still someone who was scrambling to salvage what little he could before the walls fully closed in around him. By the time I got back to my office, Ethan had already sent out a company-wide memo confirming the board's decision, making it clear that Richard no longer had any authority within the organization, and that all pending financial transactions were now under strict review. Charlotte had taken the next step before I even had the chance to suggest it, sending an urgent request to the company's legal team to freeze all remaining discretionary funds before Richard could try siphoning anything else into his offshore accounts. Despite his removal, there was still too much that he could attempt to dismantle from the outside, and we weren't about to let him walk away with so much as a penny that didn't belong to him. I barely had time to sit down before my mother called, her voice quieter than it had been earlier, less of the strength I had heard in the boardroom, more of the weight of everything sinking in, more of the realization that her husband wasn't just a liar, but a predator who had been using her for years. She told me that Richard had already contacted her, spinning another story, trying to convince her that this was all a misunderstanding, that the documents we had found were fabricated, that I had orchestrated everything to turn her against him. I wanted to believe that she had finally seen him for what he really was, wanted to trust that she wouldn't let herself be manipulated again, but when she hesitated before telling me that she needed time to process everything, I knew that part of her still wanted to believe that this wasn't real. I didn't argue with her, didn't try to push her into accepting the truth any faster than she was ready for, because I knew that if she wasn't willing to believe the evidence right in front of her, there was nothing I could say that would convince her otherwise. Instead, I told her to be careful, told her to watch how he acted now that he had lost control, told her that the moment he realized he couldn't use her anymore, he would turn against her just like he had turned against every other person who had ever been in his way. She didn't respond right away, just let out a slow, unsteady breath before telling me that she would call me later, her voice so unconvincing that I already knew she wouldn't. Ethan knocked on my door before I had time to dwell on it, his expression unreadable as he slid a folder onto my desk, flipping it open to a series of flagged bank transactions that had been processed less than an hour ago. Richard, even in his final moments of control, had still been moving money, still trying to funnel company funds into hidden accounts, still operating under the delusion that he could pull off one last scheme before disappearing entirely. The only reason we caught it in time was because of the systems Ethan had put in place over the past few weeks, real-time monitoring of every financial movement. Red flags triggered whenever funds were transferred to unverified accounts. Charlotte was already on the phone with the bank, instructing them to halt all pending transactions, her voice sharp, no room for argument, no hesitation in demanding that every suspicious account be reported to the authorities immediately. Ethan was already drafting an emergency report to the SEC, outlining the latest fraudulent activity, ensuring that by the time Richard even realized his attempts had been blocked, he would already be under formal investigation. We had expected him to retaliate, had known that he wouldn't just walk away, but watching him scramble so desperately, watching him flail in real time, watching him throw every last ounce of deception into one final act of self-preservation, it almost felt pathetic. By the end of the day, the company's assets were fully secured, every financial loophole closed, every backdoor Richard had created sealed off, every avenue he had once used to manipulate the system cut off before he could exploit it further. Charlotte called to let me know that several board members had already been contacted by outside legal counsel, their testimonies being compiled for an official case, the first steps in what would eventually become a full-scale corporate fraud investigation. Ethan sent me another update, letting me know that several of Richard's known associates had already started distancing themselves, lawyers sending quiet inquiries about potential immunity deals, the kind of thing that happened when rats started fleeing a sinking ship. I had expected things to settle after that, at least temporarily had assumed that with nowhere left to run, Richard would finally recognize the inevitable and start preparing for the legal battle he had brought upon himself. Instead, just after midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a short, clipped warning that didn't bother with pleasantries, a final attempt at intimidation from a man who had already lost everything. This isn't over. Nothing more, nothing less, no explanation, no demands, no elaboration, just a last, desperate grasp for control. from someone who had nothing left to hold on to. I stared at the screen for a long moment, considering whether it was even worth acknowledging, whether Richard still believed there was anything he could say that would shake me, whether he actually thought that, after everything, I would be afraid of him now. Instead of responding, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, tossed my phone onto my desk, leaned back in my chair, and allowed myself the smallest, briefest moment of satisfaction. The company was safe. The damage Richard had done was being undone. The people he had tried to exploit were finally seeing justice, and for the first time since my father died, I felt like things were exactly where they were supposed to be. Richard could believe whatever he wanted, could tell himself whatever stories he needed to cope with the fact that he had lost, could convince himself that somehow, in some way, he would find a way to crawl out of this. It didn't matter, because as I sat there in my father's old office, the weight of the last few weeks finally settling around me, I knew with absolute certainty that Richard would never set foot in this building again. The next morning, I walked into the office knowing that Richard was no longer a problem for us, but rather a problem for the authorities, because the moment he tried to move that last batch of stolen money, he crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. Charlotte had already been contacted by the SEC, their investigators moving faster than we had anticipated, likely because Richard's attempts at covering his tracks had been so absurdly sloppy that even a rookie forensic accountant could have followed the trail he left behind. Ethan was waiting for me when I arrived, his laptop open to the latest round of flagged transactions. But this time, it wasn't just our company's accounts we were looking at, it was Richard's entire financial history unraveling before us. We had known for weeks that Richard had done this before, had suspected that his pattern of marrying into family-owned businesses and draining them for profit wasn't unique to us. But we hadn't expected to find so many others, so many people who had been left ruined in his wake. Charlotte had been making calls since dawn, reaching out to former business partners, old employees, people whose names we had pulled from company records, and the stories were all the same. Richard had spent years orchestrating these frauds, carefully selecting his targets, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. There was no way to quantify the damage he had done, no way to measure the number of lives he had upended, no way to fully grasp the scale of his destruction until we started hearing it firsthand. By midday, the first formal lawsuits were being filed, victims coming forward with their own evidence, their own testimonies, their own proof that Richard had been running a long con that spanned more than a decade. Ethan had already started compiling everything into a master file, documenting every fraudulent transfer, every manipulated contract, every stolen asset, ensuring that by the time this was over, there wouldn't be a single loophole he could escape through. Charlotte had been contacted by federal investigators who wanted to schedule an official interview, a clear sign that this was no longer just a corporate dispute, but something much bigger, something that was about to reach far beyond our company. At some point, I stepped outside for air, the weight of everything pressing against my ribs, the sheer scope of what we had uncovered making it hard to process just how far this had gone. My father had suspected Richard years ago, had started building a case long before any of us had realized what was happening, had known deep down that a man like Richard didn't just stumble into our lives by accident. I wondered how much of this my father had already understood, how much he had managed to put together before his death, how much he had been preparing for a battle he never got the chance to finish. I didn't want to believe that he had died, knowing that Richard was coming for everything he built, didn't want to imagine him sitting alone in his office, staring at the same numbers I'd stared at, realizing that one day someone else would have to fight this war in his place. Ethan found me leaning against the railing outside, his expression unreadable as he handed me his phone, the screen already pulled up to a breaking news alert that sent a sharp, electric jolt through my spine. Richard had been arrested just hours earlier, picked up by federal agents as he attempted to board a private jet, his last desperate attempt at escape cut short before he could slip through the cracks. Charlotte had already received confirmation from the SEC that his accounts had been fully frozen, every last dollar he had tried to hide, locked down before he could access it, ensuring that for the first time in his life, he would have to answer for what he had done. The footage played on repeat. Richard in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfectly rehearsed composure finally breaking as he was led toward an unmarked car, his entire empire collapsing in real time. It didn't feel real at first, didn't feel like something that could actually be happening, didn't feel possible that after all the manipulation, all the destruction, all the lies, he was finally being forced to face the consequences of his own actions. Ethan let out a slow breath beside me, shaking his head as he muttered that he had honestly expected Richard to hold out longer, expected him to fight harder, expected him to have one last, desperate trick up his sleeve. I watched the screen for another moment, watching the way Richard kept looking over his shoulder, searching for an escape that didn't exist, realizing too late that there was nothing left for him to take. I didn't feel relief, didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected, didn't feel like celebrating because, no matter how much damage we had prevented, there were still people out there who had lost everything, still families who would never fully recover, still businesses that had been permanently destroyed. This wasn't just about Richard, wasn't just about one man's greed, wasn't just about a single con. It was about a system that allowed him to do this for years without anyone stopping him, about the cracks in the foundation that let men like him thrive. Ethan was already talking about next steps, about what we could do for the other victims, about how we could help them rebuild, about how we could use what we had learned to make sure this never happened again. I nodded, already knowing that there was no going back to how things were before, already understanding that this fight wasn't over just because Richard had finally been taken down. Charlotte sent a message just as we were heading back inside, telling me that our mother had officially filed for divorce, that she had already started the process of removing Richard from her life, that she had finally accepted the truth we had been trying to show her all along. I knew it wouldn't be easy for her, knew that she would spend months, maybe even years, questioning every moment she had shared with him, wondering how she had missed the signs, replaying every conversation, every memory, every decision that had led her to this point. I sent her a message, nothing long, nothing complicated, just a simple reminder that she wasn't alone, that no matter how much Richard had taken from us, he hadn't taken everything, that we were still here, that we would make it through this together.